have you join that group, especially if you're curious about how the Bible, the entire Bible, speaks to God's redemptive plan for your life. This is a great group for you to join, and it gives you a chance to get to know some of the great people here at Branches. Also, if you're new or relatively new to Branches, we have new mugs for you in the back. And if you're new in your faith relationship with Jesus, we've got some next steps there for you. We're all about QR codes. We tested those. Those work. So otherwise, we're embarrassed about the one that doesn't. And Tim fell on the sword. It was actually me that did it, not Tim, but I appreciate him doing that for me. I'm always curious on Easter how we all ended up here today. Like, some of us are here because Branches is our church, and we find ourselves here more Sundays than not, right? Some of you came because somebody you know goes to Branches, and they invited you to come, and they convinced you that this was safe enough and cool enough for you to come, so you did. Some of you may have been driving by our sign over the last month or so and saw that Branches at 11 o'clock join us for Easter, and you were curious, and so here you are. And some of you heard that you've been hearing about this awesome church with two pastors that make it work, and you just felt like you had to be here today. Whatever brought you, we're super excited that you're here. Thanks for coming. And I can tell you this, I am only here because I'm only able to be here, and certainly I'm only able to be up front here because God is in the business of redeeming broken and brokenhearted people. In fact, God specializes in redeeming the lives of broken and brokenhearted people. Some of you know, but many of you don't. My story is this. I was 17 years old in Charleston, South Carolina. I was involved in a high-end cocaine dealing operation, is how I describe it. And I got a call that my grandfather in Chicago was sick. So I flew to Chicago to see my grandfather, not knowing what we would talk about, not really wanting to talk about my life. And I sat down next to him on what would be his deathbed. He died 6 weeks later. And we sat there in awkward silence until my grandfather reached out and put his hand on my knee and began to weep and just say, "Todd, I'm so sorry for all that's going on in your life. I'm so sorry." And I realized in that moment, like, my grandfather's Jesus to me in this moment. He's dying and he's in pain, yet he's weeping over the pain he discerns in my life. And that changed my life and the course of my life forever. And you would think that would be enough, right? You would think that one experience with my grandfather being Jesus would be enough for me to live on the straight and narrow for the rest of my life, right? It wasn't. 20 years later, I find myself having multiple back surgeries, the doctor in Washington who's the #1 prescriber of opiates, and I'm addicted to pain medication. I was sitting at the Betty Ford Center in Rancho Mirage, California, thinking my life as I know it is over. I'm gonna have to get a new career. I'm gonna have to figure out how to do life on my own. I don't know if my family will have me when I come back. It was a scary time. I had no idea how deep God's redemptive love for us really is. I had no idea the lengths God would go to pursue us and restore us to a life of purpose. I had no idea how the lengths he would go for me to restore me to a life of purpose. But that's what God's in the business of doing. He redeems us not just once, but as often as we need him to do it, he does it for us. So whatever condition you're in today, there's great hope for you. And maybe that's why you're here. Maybe that's the real reason you're here, is to experience the relentlessly tender love of Jesus that's been pursuing you your whole life. Maybe you're here because you need to experience it afresh once again. Maybe you're here because you just need to experience it for the first time. What we experience today all hinges on what our reaction is to the resurrection of Jesus. And so that's what we're going to look at today. Obviously, it's Easter, and we're going to look at eyewitness accounts of the resurrection. We're going to see how the first eyewitnesses reacted to the resurrection, and we're going to ask ourselves two questions. One, do I see myself in any one of these people reacting to the risen Jesus for the first time? And then the second question is, what's my reaction to the risen Jesus? Mary Magdalene's the first one we're going to look at. And Mary, she was somebody that Jesus had freed from being tormented by 7 demons. So she has a love reaction to the resurrection of Jesus. She moved from being in a state of not Greece, maybe she was, but grief. I try to say grief and loss together. Grief and loss and uncertainty, and she moved from that place to a place of love and a place of joy and peace and worship. And depending on what's going on in your life these days, you might find yourself in Mary's reaction to Jesus. The disciples reacted to the resurrection from a place of deep despair and fear. And they went from having this deep despair and deep fear to being men of great courage who found renewed purpose for their life. And maybe that's where you see yourself. Maybe there's fear and anxiety and uncertainty in your life. And encountering the resurrected Jesus today might just move you from that fear and anxiety to a place of hope and peace and courage and renewed purpose in your life. In the wake of the crucifixion, the disciples were hiding behind locked doors. They were afraid that the people that put Jesus to death were going to come for them. They were disillusioned, and they were trying to figure out why the things in their relationship with Jesus didn't work out the way that they thought and hoped they would work out. Have you ever been there? Yeah, so maybe we see ourselves in their reaction. Then there's poor Thomas, this guy who for all of history into perpetuity will forever be known as a guy who doubted and was skeptical. Poor guy. His reaction, though, to the resurrection took him from that doubt and that skepticism to proclaiming his undying faith in Jesus. He ends up proclaiming, "My Lord and my God." But before he did that, Thomas famously said, "I'm not going to believe until I see Jesus. I'm not going to believe until I put my hands in his finger or his hands and my hand in his side and see his wounds." Maybe that's you. Maybe you're skeptical about the church and it took you a little bit to get here today. Maybe you're not sure about the resurrection, whether you can believe it or not. But maybe as the living Jesus reveals himself to you, if you remain curious, you might just end up in that place, unexpectedly even, that Thomas was, where you proclaim, "My Lord and my God." Maybe. If John's gospel were a biography like every other biography that's been written about historical figures, there would be no chapter 20 or 21 in John's gospel. Every other biography written after the life of a historical figure ends with the death of the subject of the book. But Jesus isn't like anybody that's ever lived in all of history. Jesus died 2,000 years ago, was raised from the dead, and still lives today. Not only does he still live, but the Bible tells us, Romans tells us, that he's seated at the right hand of God. And you know what he's doing at the right hand of God? He's pleading for you and for me. He's advocating with God for you and for me. I'll say it again, but Jesus is not unaware of what's happening in your life. He's very aware. He's acutely aware of what's happening in your life. Psalm 37 says that he concerns himself with the very details of your life, and he involves himself in the very details of your life. The gospel hinges on the resurrection. If it wasn't for the resurrection, the gospel loses all its power. And the gospel is simply this, that Jesus lived a life that we couldn't possibly live, and he died the death that we should have died in our place as a sacrifice for our sin. He lived a perfect and sinless life, and then he offered that perfect and sinless life on the cross for us so that we wouldn't have to face the consequences of our sin and brokenness. That's the power of the resurrection. And when we put our faith in the risen Jesus, God forever looks at us and sees us and views us as completely forgiven and completely righteous. That's a phenomenal gift that's offered to us. So let's get into the passage. John 20, verse 1. Early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, "They've taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." So Luke 24, if you look at that account, tells us that not only did Mary Magdalene go, but Mary, the mother of Jesus, a woman named Joanna, and several other women went to the tomb that early that Sunday morning. And they went early on that Sunday morning because Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who had cared for the body of Jesus after he died, didn't have enough time to properly prepare his body the way that Jewish people prepared bodies for the grave. Jesus died late on Friday, and at sundown, Sabbath starts, and Tim told us last week that you couldn't work on the Sabbath, so they hurried to put Jesus' body together, put it in the tomb. But these ladies came early Sunday morning to put the spices on the body and to honor Jesus' body the way that he needed to be honored in their eyes. Their biggest concern as they're headed towards the cross or toward the tomb is, how are we going to get that big stone that's in front of the tomb rolled away? And so as when they see the tomb, they immediately see that the tomb is empty, and they think the worst. And John focuses on Mary Magdalene instead of the other women because she was the first one to see the tomb empty, and she was the first one to encounter the risen Jesus. So when they see that empty tomb, they think, well, one of two things probably happened. Either the grave has been robbed, which wasn't uncommon. It was common, though, for people to be buried with their valuables, so you could make quite a living robbing graves. It's a gross way to make a living and not legal, but you could make a good living doing that. The other thing they thought was maybe the authorities had come and taken Jesus' body just to inflict more pain and more anxiety on the disciples. But that wasn't likely, because out of anybody here in the story that knew what to expect, it was the people that put Jesus to death. They're the only ones who said, hey, remember that Jesus said that he was going to rise from the dead, so maybe we should seal the tomb and put guards outside the tomb in order to make sure the disciples don't come and steal the body and fake a resurrection. The leaders who put Jesus to death are the only ones who even considered that Jesus could be raised from the dead. None of his disciples, none of his followers even thought about that. It's interesting that Mary Magdalene, who does she run to? She runs to Peter and to John, but first to Peter to tell Peter what had happened at the tomb. It's interesting that she did that because Peter had famously betrayed Jesus, abandoned Jesus, denied Jesus. But even after failing in such a public way, Peter is still seen as the leader of the disciples, and Mary still sees him as a leader, and she goes to him, which tells us something about Peter. It tells us that he was, for all his flaws, he was a man that everybody respected for sure. And because she went to Peter, it also tells us that we can never disqualify ourselves from being loved by God or being used by God, no matter what we've done. So if you're sitting here and you've blown things up in your life, even if you've blown things up very publicly, you are not out of God's reach. You're not out of his loving reach, and you certainly aren't out of his reach for him using your life for great purpose. I'm here to tell you. If you've blown your life up like that, I would say welcome to the club. You're among friends. We've all done that. And many of us know what it is to blow things up in a major way and then still be loved and welcomed back into the fold of God, and for God to use us in great and powerful ways. As long as we've got breath in this life, there is hope for us. As long as we've got breath, no matter what we've done, there's hope for redemption. So if you need that, then embrace that hope. Verse 3 and 4 here. Let me take a drink and then I'll be right with you. Peter and the other disciples started out for the tomb, and this needs to be closer to me. They were both, this is important, I got to do it right. Peter and the other disciples started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. So John and Peter are basically racing to the tomb, which is kind of comical. Because John, who's writing the gospel, he makes it known that Peter is much older and fatter and in worse shape than he is, and can't get to the tomb even though he gave him a head start before John got there. So this stuff, if they were making it up, you don't add this stuff, these interpersonal, not conflicts, but competitions. If you were making something like this up, you wouldn't put this in the story. When we see stuff like this, we can rely on the fact that this is an authentic account of what actually happened. So they get to the tomb and they look in. But before that, if you read John's gospel, John refers to himself often as the one whom Jesus loved, or the disciple that Jesus loved. And John isn't saying that Jesus loved him more than he loved all the other disciples. What John is saying is that what he knew more than anything in his life to be true and real was that he was loved by Jesus. In fact, that love was so powerful in John's life that it became his identity. No matter what he did or who he was, above all, he was the disciple whom Jesus loved. How different would your life be if you identified that way? How different would your life be if you identified above your job, above being a parent, above being a spouse, above every other thing as the one who Jesus loved? I think it would make a powerful difference. One of our distinctives here at Branches is that we want to make sure that we understand our identity, that our identity is, as a follower of Jesus and a child of God, the one whom Jesus loved, and not who he loved, but who he loves, present. How much better would our life be if we were intimately aware that no matter what's happening in our life, we are covered by and surrounded by and enveloped by the love that resurrected Jesus from the dead? How do we respond to that love? How will we? So verse 5, John stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. John was cautious and careful. Then Simon Peter arrives and does exactly what we think he would do. He goes right inside. And he also noticed that the linen wrappings were lying there, and while the cloth had covered Jesus' head, it was folded and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first, again, he's reminding us that he was faster than Peter, also went in, and he saw and believed. For until then, they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home, which is just weird. So John gets there ahead of Peter, and he stands there and he looks in. Wants to take it all in, wants to take some time before he goes in. Peter just rushes in and takes a look. And what they see tells them immediately that the grave had not been robbed, because the grave clothes are lying right where the body was, and they're not messed up. They're lying there as though the body just passed through them and left them right where they were. And not only that, the wrappings that were around Jesus' head were folded neatly and placed where his head had been. Robbers don't leave things neatly placed like that. So they start to think about what this could mean. What does this evidence in front of them tell them about what's happened? And John's the first one to believe that Jesus has risen from the dead. But he doesn't believe because he's standing in the tomb looking at the empty grave and thinking, oh yeah, Jesus told us like 3 times that this would happen. That's not what he thinks of. He thinks of the Old Testament prophecy that he learned somewhere along the line that said the Messiah would be raised from the dead. He's still not connected with what Jesus had told him. Neither was Peter, but they both took the evidence that they saw there and they believe. They're both convinced by what they saw and what they remember. But what do? Instead of like high-fiving each other and going, wow, Jesus was right, he is alive, and going and telling everybody that Jesus raised from the dead, starting with the people that put him on the cross, they don't do that. They go home. They go home knowing that Jesus is alive. If you're struggling to believe in the resurrection, and if you've got a scientific mind that says, if you just give me the evidence, then I'll believe, that evidence might not be as good for you as you think it is. They had all the evidence right there, Peter and John, and they believed that Jesus was resurrected from the dead based on that evidence. They had an intellectual awareness that Jesus wasn't there, that he had risen from the dead. But that intellectual awareness and all that evidence didn't change their lives, didn't change their circumstances. They still went home, and they were just as afraid and just as confused and just as isolated as they had been before. They still go back to hiding behind locked doors, afraid of those who killed Jesus. So we need more than just the evidence. We need an encounter with the risen Jesus, with the resurrected Jesus. It wasn't until these guys see the resurrected Jesus that their lives are changed. So, and when they do, they go from cowering in fear to being people that didn't reflect who they were before they encountered the resurrected Jesus. They were fearful, and then they became bold, and they gave their lives, literally, to proclaim the good news about Jesus. So we don't have the luxury of seeing the evidence of the empty tomb, but we have the Bible, and we have these eyewitness accounts of the resurrection. And as we look at this, our question should be, what's our reaction? What's our response? What will we do with these accounts? Verse 11, Mary was standing outside the tomb crying, and she wasn't just crying. When Lazarus was dead, everybody was weeping. They were wailing. So she is weeping and wailing and crying. She goes back to the tomb here. So Mary's standing outside the tomb crying, and as she wept, she stooped and looked in. She saw 2 white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other sitting at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. Dear woman, why are you crying? the angels asked her. Because they've taken away my Lord, she replied, and I don't know where they've put him. So Mary returns to the tomb because Peter and John have gone home. They didn't connect. Mary doesn't know what they know. Mary doesn't know that they now believe that Jesus is risen from the dead. So she goes back to the tomb, and when she gets there, she encounters two angels. And we would think that encountering two angels in white robes sitting at the head and foot of where Jesus' body had been would do something to elevate Mary's mood, right? That seeing angels would give her hope. In fact, if you look at a different gospel version of the resurrection, the angels say, why are you looking for the living among the dead, right? So they're giving her information about Jesus, but she doesn't care that there are angels there. Other than places like, Isaiah 6, where angels are described as these amazing creatures, angels often show up just as regular people. So I don't know if you remember, when I was a kid, my mother used to listen to this Amy Grant song, and it was Entertaining Angels or something like that. And the song was all about how we entertain angels and don't even know it because they look like regular people. Well, that was true here for Mary. She just sees them as regular people, and she doesn't care who they are or what they're about. The only thing she cares about is what happened to the body of my Lord. What happened to the body of Jesus? And as Mary leaves the tomb, we get one of the greatest reveals scenes in all of human literature, not just the Bible, but all of literature. Second only is probably Joseph in Genesis 45. You know the story of Joseph. His brothers hate him, and so they throw him in a pit. They were going to kill him, but they sold him into slavery. And he goes through just horrible thing after a horrible thing, but he ends up being the prime minister of Egypt, and his brothers come to him 20-some years later looking for food. And after he runs them through the ringer to prove that he can trust them, he says, I'm Joseph. And we have this powerful reunion of this family. That's pretty good, but this is better. Jesus said in John 10:3, he said, the shepherd walks right up to the gate. The gatekeeper opens the gate to him, and the sheep recognize his voice. That's what happens to Mary here. Look at what it says. Verse 14, she turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. Dear woman, why are you crying? Jesus asked her. Who are you looking for? As if he didn't know. She thought he was the gardener. Sir, she said, if you've taken him away, tell me where you've put him and I will go and get him. And then he just says, Mary. And everything changes for her. Because as soon as he speaks her name, she knows who it is. And she cries out, Rabboni, which is the equivalent of saying, my Lord, my master. And she just clung to Jesus and didn't want to let him go. There's a lot written about this little reveal scene. A lot of theologians debate, as to why Mary didn't recognize Jesus. Some say, well, Mary had her back to Jesus, so how could she know who he was? And others say, well, maybe Jesus cloaked his identity with Mary the way that he did with those two guys on the road to Emmaus, and so she couldn't know who he was. Or maybe Mary was grieving to such the extent and wailing and weeping that she just couldn't identify Jesus through her tears and through her wailing. Whatever it is, when she hears Jesus speak her voice, everything changes, and she cries out, Rabboni. The only other place we see anybody call Jesus Rabboni is Bartimaeus. We looked at him a couple weeks ago when the blind man who was living in the gutter came to Jesus, and Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? Bartimaeus said, Rabboni, my Lord, my master, I want to see. So it's everything changed for Bartimaeus there, just the way everything changed for Mary here. And again, whatever the circumstances are in your life right now, even the things you don't want to tell anybody, God knows about it. And again, not only does he know about it, he cares deeply about it. He concerns himself with the very details of our life. And he concerns himself with those details so that our life is better, so that he does it for our good and for his glory. Verse 17, Jesus says, as Mary's hanging on to him, don't cling to me, for I haven't ascended to the Father, but go find my brothers and tell them I am ascending to the Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Again, this passage gets a lot of attention. Like, why doesn't Jesus want Mary to cling to him? And I used to think, for a long time, I thought, because I was taught this probably, that there was something about the resurrected body of Jesus that wasn't quite glorified and couldn't be touched until he went to the Father and got things straightened out. I don't even know what that means. But what he's really telling Mary is, you can't keep clinging to me because we've got work to do. you've got work to do, starting with going to tell my disciples that you've seen me and talked to me. So, and Jesus tells Mary to go tell the brothers that I am risen. Jesus had never called the disciples brothers before. If you look back in John 13, he calls them servants or slaves. In John 15, he calls them friends. But here he calls them brothers. And by calling them brothers, he's saying that they can now share, they do now share in the power and the glory that raised Jesus from the dead. Which means that if they share in that power and glory, any one of us that is a follower of Jesus right now, no matter what's going on in our life, we also share in the power and glory of the resurrection. Can you imagine what we could do if we regularly tapped into the power and glory that raised Jesus from the dead? Branches Church would have an amazing impact on the city of Woodinville, because people would know that we are here, they would know that we love and care about them, and they would see through our lives that knowing and following Jesus isn't what they thought it was. It's so much better. In fact, it's everything. I hope we do tap into that. We will. We need to. Tim and I have been talking about that, actually. We've been talking about how we can do that. We've been talking about doing things like adopting a school, just partnering with one of the local schools and doing whatever they need us to do, so just so that they know that we're here and we love them and we want to serve them. We've been talking, in the past, we've talked about coming around first responders, serving and caring for first responders, because their job is incredibly difficult. Man, if we did that, if we loved our neighbors in that kind of way, this church would have a huge impact on the city around us. So if that's something you want to do, by the way, we're not going to do it alone, and we can't do it alone. We've got to do it together. And if you want to adopt a school with us, let us know, and we'll have you, we'll get you signed up. Don't worry. Verse 18, Mary Magdalene found the disciples and told them, I have seen the Lord, and then she gave them his message. It's truly amazing that God chose to reveal the resurrected Jesus to women first. And it's amazing because women had very little credibility in this culture. The testimony of women held no weight or water whatsoever. And so if you were, again, the fact that God chose to reveal to women gives us great confidence that what we're reading here in these Gospels is true. Because if you were making this story up, knowing your first century audience was primarily Jewish, they wouldn't really love the fact that they had to rely on the testimony of women. But the disciples are writing what happened. They're writing what's true, and we can have great confidence in that. Mark 16 tells us, though, that when Mary showed up and told the disciples what Jesus had said, they didn't believe her. Jesus had told them no less than 3 times, I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be handed over to the leading priests. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to be beaten. I'm going to be killed. But on the 3rd day, I'm going to rise again. He had told them that no less than 3 times, yet none of his disciples are anticipating Jesus' resurrection. Not on the 3rd day, not on any day. Right? Maybe not until resurrection day when everybody is resurrected. So they don't believe her because they think the story, even though Jesus told them at least 3 times, they think the story is too fanciful and too unbelievable. The worst thing we can do when we encounter the resurrected Jesus is to remain unmoved. So my hope for you, my prayer for you is that if you came in wondering, am I going to believe? Is this the time when I might surrender to Jesus? My hope is that you don't leave this place unmoved. My hope is that no matter who we are, that we don't leave this place unmoved. The disciples chose to remain unmoved. They chose to remain cowering in fear behind locked doors. That is a far worse alternative than surrendering to Jesus. And because they refused to believe, there's despairing. And if we refuse to believe, then nothing in our life is likely to change. But if we open ourselves up to the risen Jesus, then our life will begin to change in amazing ways, in ways that we never thought of and never expected our life could change. So look at what Jesus does for his disciples. He shows up. That Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. Shalom, he says, peace be with you. As he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and his side, and they were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. Again, he said, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. Then he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you don't forgive them, they are not forgiven. Jesus has a real body. He has a body that can be seen and touched, and it can eat food and drink drinks, but it's not bound by the laws of physics because he didn't need to open the door to get in the room, right? He just showed up among them. And initially, the disciples are more terrified of Jesus standing there in their midst than they were before he got there. Knowing that, Jesus says, shalom, peace be with you. But he's not just saying peace. Shalom means may you be saved from all trouble. May God give you every good thing. That's what he's saying to them. Jesus showed up for his disciples in the very same way Jesus shows up for us in the midst of our fear, in the midst of our pain, in the midst of our uncertainty, and he speaks his peace all over our lives. What do we do with that? How do we respond? Jesus turned their fear and despair into hope and purpose, and they were never the same. And he breathed the Holy Spirit on them, which is amazing. It's the same way that God breathed life into Adam in the creation account. It's the same way, and we sang it in that song, where the wind of the Spirit blows through Ezekiel 37, and this valley of dry bones begins to rattle and shake and come to life until it's this huge and powerful army. God does the same thing for us. He shows up in the midst of our terrible circumstances, and he speaks peace over us, and he breathes his Spirit into our lives and into our circumstances. How many of us need that? I certainly do. So Jesus then commissioned the disciples to share the gospel, which they did with unflinching power and authority. They gave their lives to share the gospel. They were passionate and fearless. And Jesus commissions us as well. It's our primary calling as followers of Jesus to worship God with all that we are, heart, soul, mind, and whatever else I said, heart, soul, spirit, and mind, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. That, if we do anything as followers of Jesus, those are the two things we have to do, right? And then also make disciples. If we were to adopt a school, if we were to care for first responders, if we were to love our neighbors by meeting just their basic needs, it would go a long way. It would go a long way. Then there's Thomas. Verse 24, one of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed Didymus, the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came. And they told him, we've seen the Lord. But he replied, I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hand into the wound in his side. Very specific demands he has here. 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. Peace be with you. He has to say peace because it terrifies him every time he does this. Now I lost my place. Peace be with you. And he said, he said to Thomas, put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe. So he meets Thomas's demands, but also gives him a little bit of a lesson there. And then Thomas does that, and he exclaims, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus said, you believe because you've seen me. Blessed are those like you who believe because we haven't seen. So poor Thomas, man, he had been out grieving on his own when Jesus first appeared to the disciples. And we can't blame him for that. Like every once in a while, we need to be alone and by ourselves and figure things out. We can't fault him for that, but we can learn something from Thomas. When we neglect this community, when we're not a regular part of a community like this, then we miss out on what God's doing. We miss out on the things that we need. Thomas had to wait 8 days. And in that environment, 8 days was forever before he got the same experience that the other disciples had. So when we miss meeting together, when we miss being in groups together, when we miss this community, we miss a lot. The Christian life is never meant to be lived alone. And when we try to go it alone, we find that it's not easy and we miss quite a bit. Do we see ourselves in Thomas? Have we ever said, God, I'll believe, but you got to prove it to me? Maybe you said that this morning before you came to church. Okay, I'll believe, God, but you have to show up in some way and just reveal yourself to me so that I'm absolutely sure that you are who you say you are. He might do that for you. I'm not sure, but he might. Warren Wiersbe says it a lot better about Thomas than I could, so let me just read a little bit to you here. He says this: Thomas' words help us understand the difference between doubt and unbelief. Doubt says, I cannot believe, there are too many problems. Unbelief says, I will not believe unless you give me the evidence I ask for. Thomas reminds us that unbelief robs us of blessings and opportunities. It may sound sophisticated and intellectual to question what Jesus did, but such questions are usually evidence of hard hearts, not searching minds. Thomas represents the scientific approach to life, and it did not work. After all, when a skeptic says, I will not believe unless, he's already admitting that he does believe. He believes in the validity of the test or experiment that he has devised. If he can have faith in his own scientific approach, why can he not have faith in what God has revealed? Even atheists believe. Even those who say, I don't believe there's a God, put their faith in the fact, in their belief that there is no God. And that's a big gamble, but it's faith, right? So we all live by faith one way or another. We either put our faith in Jesus, we put our faith in the fact that there is no Jesus, or we put our faith in ourselves or in somebody else. But we all put our faith somewhere. What are you putting your faith in right now? Where is your faith? Nothing but Jesus will fill the emptiness that you feel in your life. Nothing and no one but Jesus will soothe the ache that you often feel in your heart, in your soul. And he's here. He's here and he's among us and he stands before you with his arms wide open. And just as he spoke Mary's name, he speaks your name. Can you hear him speak? You hear him speak your name. When you hear Jesus speak your name and call you into a relationship with himself, it changes everything for us. And it changes everything for the better. So I don't know who you relate to here in this story, in this account the most. Maybe it's Mary. Maybe what you need and what you can experience is the risen Jesus moving you from fear and uncertainty and grief and pain to hope and worship and peace. Or maybe like the disciples, there's a lot of fear and anxiety in your life. There's uncertainty, there's despair. The risen Jesus can move you from those experiences to a place of courage and confidence and to a renewed purpose for your life that when you experience it, you wish it hadn't taken you so long to realize that this was your purpose. Maybe you're like Thomas and you needed proof. You need Jesus to prove it to you. Well, he's proven it to you through these eyewitness accounts. He's proven it to you by showing up here and opening his life to you, offering to meet your every need for your benefit and his glory. How do you respond? Let's pray. Father, thank you for how you told your story. Thank you for how you revealed yourself to people who weren't expecting you to come. They should have been, but they weren't. Father, as we gather here this morning, we come from different places and different experiences with you. We come, some of us having been hurt by the church and not sure that we want to give ourselves to another church experience. But we desperately need you. God, help us to, with your help, get over our fear so that we can experience all that you are and all that you have. God, if we've been demanding that you show us who you are, help us to see that you already are in so many ways so that we believe. Help us to respond to you by crying out, Rabboni, by exclaiming, my Lord and my God. And as we do, God, may our lives never be the same, because without you, they aren't worth living. We thank you for loving us. We thank you for standing in our place and offering your life for ours, and for seeing us as righteous and forgiven. God, help us to tap into that and to the power that makes that real. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to take communion as we do here every Sunday in just a minute. And you're welcome to take communion if you're a follower of Jesus. We're going to have two lines. Just come on down the center and go out the sides. As you come, maybe this is an opportunity to surrender to the risen Jesus for the first time, or to surrender again to the risen Jesus, to experience his power in your life.